Year 2100. The skies over America were no longer the clear blue of a painted dream, but veiled in a permanent haze of dust, heat, and silence. After decades of wars over dwindling resources and irreversible climate change, the Midwest had turned into cracked desert. Fields that once shimmered gold with corn and rippled green with rice now lay barren, broken earth dotted with artificial trees designed to measure fine dust and radiation. Flowers no longer bloomed with the seasons. Plants survived only in elite greenhouses where sunlight was filtered through CO2's barrier membranes, and seeds were genetically programmed to bloom in sync with energy cycles. People relied on drones to pollinate each robotic arm, standing in for the millions of bee wings that had disappeared. But the cost was astronomical, so fruits and vegetables became a luxury for the wealthy. For everyone else, meals were synthetic nutrient tablets, odorless, tasteless, emotionless. In a cold, glass-enclosed city in the state of Illinois, a 5-year-old boy looked up at his mother after spotting a picture of a bee in an old fairy tale book. "Mom," he asked, "what's a bee?" The mother froze. She wanted to answer, but her throat caught. The question echoed like a wake-up call in a world that had grown far too used to nature's silence. No more buzzing, no more blossoms, no more of the simple things once taken for granted. On the 43rd floor of a towering skyscraper in the International Biological Research District, Daniela, former PhD in insect genetics, sat with his eyes locked on the screen. Data cells streamed down, mapping the trajectory of the 19th generation artificial pollination model. He pressed enter, then slumped into his chair, rubbing his temples in exhaustion. 2 buildings over, Ariahi's wife, also a former researcher, was working for a biotech pharmaceutical firm. Her job was to develop the floral sensation capsule, a synthetic scent pill designed to make users feel like they were standing in the middle of a real flower field. Both had once been top students at the University of California, Berkeley, known for its groundbreaking research on native bee species. Back then, they dreamed of a biological farm where insects and humans could live together, sharing in the rhythm of life. But then, life happened. Parents fell ill. Scholarships were cut. They packed their dreams into a suitcase, moved to the city, and found office jobs. Stable, predictable, but hollow. Daniel still kept the old notebook where they had once sketched their vision for a self-restoring bee ecosystem. Whenever Aria saw him open it, she would turn away, not out of resentment, but from the pain of remembering. Because they had once had everything: brilliance, youth, belief, and lost it all. Today, like every other day, Daniel received another report in his inbox. Zone 22B has lost 4 more native plant species due to lack of pollination. He closed his eyes. His chest tightened. No one remembered the bees anymore, but he did, and so did she. Somewhere in their hearts, the old dream hadn't died. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for someone brave enough to light the spark again. But that was about to change. Before the last bee falls, they would do one final thing, not for science, but for the belief that, if life once existed, it can return. They had met in their sophomore year applied entomology class. She was the girl with thin glasses who always sat in the front row, and he was the boy who carried a tiny observation hive to study honeybee behavior. Back then, on the tree-lined campus of Berkeley, bees still hovered over lavender bushes, and students still debated how to decode the waggle dance. Aria remembered the first time Daniel brought her to the experimental apiary outside the city. He handed her a coarse mesh beekeeper's hat, pointed at the buzzing bees, and passionately explained the communication dance used by foragers to guide others to the field. She laughed. "You're more bee than human," he winked, "because bees don't know how to give up." That evening, they sat beneath a sprawling tree, surrounded by the soft hum of wings, and for the first time dreamed aloud. An ecological beekeeping farm where bees wouldn't just survive, but learned to adapt to climate change. They would breed stronger native strains. They would grow year-round flowers. They would write down that dream, line by line, diagram by diagram, in a notebook with a dust-colored cover. Project Pollinator, revive the buzz. But the world didn't wait. The resource wars broke out. The university cut funding. Daniel's father fell ill. Aria juggled 2 jobs to pay for her mother's medical bills. They set aside their research, and eventually, the dream itself. The notebook was folded shut, slipped into an old book box when they moved to the city just for a few years, they told themselves. But those few years stretched into a decade. They fell in love, got married, but somewhere between prescriptions, utility bills, and overloaded meeting calendars, something inside them slowly fell silent. It wasn't that their love faded, but rather the ache of 2 souls who had once touched something immense and let it go. One weekend night, as Daniel had dozed off at his desk, Aria was digging through their storage room for old research files when she stumbled across the dust-colored notebook from years ago. She opened it, and though the ink had faded, the words were still theramaps, diagrams of bee thermal sensors, lists of drought-tolerant plant species. On the final page, she found her own handwriting from 2023. If one day we have to stop, promise me there will come a time when we return. Aria clutched the notebook, her tears staining the brittle paper cover. She walked over to Daniel, gently placing the notebook on the desk. He opened his eyes, looked at her tired, confused. She didn't speak at first. Only after a long pause did Aria quietly ask, as if whispering to the youngest version of themselves, "Do we still have a chance?" Daniel didn't answer right away. But in his eyes after so many years there flickered the same light Aria had fallen in love with, hope. No one restarts their life out of joy. They do it when there's nothing left to lose. Daniel and Aria sold the last apartment. They still owned the one that had once held the laughter of their student days, and also the silence of watching Aria's mother pass away during the great air conditioning outage of the summer of 2080. With the little money they had left after taxes and debts, they bought a barren piece of land in southern New Mexico, a place that had once been a biodiversity hotspot before desertification claimed it. That land held nothing but stones, wind, and the rotting wooden frames of a long-abandoned apiary. But to them, it was a beginning. On the first day of rebuilding, Aria gently placed down a small box of bees, the last viable colony they had been able to acquire from a conservation center in Canada onto the cracked soil. The bees were frail, trembling after the long journey, released into 104 Fahrenheit, 40 °C heat. Daniel carefully planted wildflowers they'd grown from ancient seed species once native to prairie grasslands, drought-tolerant and nutritionally rich. But nature didn't welcome them as they had hoped. Temperatures swung wildly. Dust storms swept across the plain. Pollen was buried beneath layers of sand. By the 3rd day, 2/3 of the bees hadn't returned to the hive. By the 5th day, a hive collapsed when the ground gave way after a rare, violent downpour. By the 7th day, only 1 bee remained alive. Aria found it struggling to pull its legs out of a crystallized drop of honey, hardened by the relentless sun. She gently lifted the tiny bee, rinsed it with clean water, and placed it onto a flower that had not yet wilted. "Please don't die," she whispered and then cried. Daniel sat in the middle of the empty hive, still holding the wooden frame he hadn't had the chance to place. He didn't cry, but his vacant stare was that of someone who had just lost the last thread tying him to the world. They had failed, again. But that night, as a rare cool breeze passed through the scrublands, Aria flipped open the old notebook. Among the faded notes, she found a sketch of a climate-controlled hive designed using a compound extracted from an ancient desert plant called Indigo Saelis, once used by indigenous tribes to retain soil moisture. She placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder. Maybe the bees didn't die from the heat. Maybe they just needed a different kind of home. And the next day, they started again. Not with optimism, but with a resilient kind of love like the first bees that leave the hive, not knowing if there will be a way back. 3 weeks after what had seemed like their final failure, Arya received a call from the archive manager at their old university, where she and Daniel had once studied entomological biology. "Professor Martinez has passed." The voice on the other end trembled. "But before he died, he told me, if the two of you were still chasing that old dream, you should check drawer number 9. Arya stood still. Daniel was silent. Martinez had been the first to teach them about the vital role of bees. He was the only one who truly believed that humanity could live more kindly if only it learned to care for the smallest of creatures. They drove through the night to the university. In the dusty old archive room, drawer number 9 sat quietly between time-worn cabinets. Inside, along with old insect specimens and yellowing handwritten notes, was a thick stack of paperson, a slanted script Arya recognized instantly. The cover read, "Eleuthera floris, the forgotten seed of life." According to the notes, this plant had once grown naturally in the northern highlands. It secreted a natural compound that stabilized cellular membranes under fluctuating climate conditions, and most astonishingly, pollinators living near it had a 40% longer lifespan than average. Daniel read the final line and choked up. "We haven't lost. We just haven't found the right flower yet." Hope rekindled. Arya quickly searched for remaining seed sources and discovered that Eleuthera floris had once been preserved in a small biological seed bank in Alberta, Canada, before the site was shut down due to post-war funding cuts. The risks were high. The journey would be long and dangerous. The area was still rumored to have landmines and wild animals. But they decided to go. If this is the last chance, then let it live. That journey became a trial by snow, fire, and memory. They endured days without fresh food, survived a sudden blizzard, and even faced a moment where they thought they'd lost each other forever in the dense Canadian forest. And then, they found it. The seed box was locked inside a lead-lined, cold room still intact. On its lid, in faded handwriting, were the words, "Eleuthera floris, do not discard, for future pollinators." They brought the seeds home. Arya's hands trembled as she planted the first ones into soil enriched with a biological substrate Daniel had crafted from algae and crushed honeycomb stone. 2 weeks later, the first green sprouts emerged. And 7 days after that, the first hive of bees survived a full 30 days. Not a single bee died. Not a single bee went missing. Arya buried her head into Daniel's shoulder, her tears soaking through his shirt. They chose to stay. And for the first time in years, the buzzing returned clear and unmistakable. Not from a drone, not from a speaker, but from life truly reviving. Arya sat inside their small wooden cabin in the New Mexico desert, the golden afternoon sun slanting through the window, casting warm light across jars of the season's first honey collected from the surviving hive. On her laptop screen, she carefully trimmed each frame. The video was just 1 minute and 43 seconds long, no background music. No effects, only the quiet footage of bees slowly pollinating the blooming Eleuthera floris in sunlight. At the end of the video, her voice whispered softly, barely audible. "This is not a miracle, this is our last chance. If you can still hear the bees, you still have time to change." She clicked post and closed the laptop. Neither of them expected anything special. But within just 24 hours, the video had surpassed 1 million views. The headline, "The Last Bees Are Still With Us," began appearing across ecological forums, then national newspapers, and even on television networks that had long abandoned environmental topics after the war. A 10-second clip played over and over again. A bee pausing for a long time on a bloom of Eleuthera, buzzing softly, almost like it was whispering something to the earth and sky. One reporter wrote, "I never thought the sound of buzzing could make me cry." Messages flooded their inbox. A biology teacher asked for materials to start a class on natural pollination. A mother wrote that her 7-year-old son, who once asked, "What's a bee?" was now covering their fridge in bee stickers and saying, "I'll protect them." A drone engineer wrote, "I never realized that what I built to replace nature would end up breaking my heart. Thank you for bringing the bees back." Daniel stood before the hive, watching the bees diligently flit from flower to flower, his hand tightening around the old notebook he and Arya had written in during their university days. The biology formulas, the pages of entomological analysis thought to be the remnants of a forgotten dream, were now becoming the key to saving what was left of the planet. He spoke softly, almost as if to himself. "We're not just saving the bees, we're restoring the memory of this world, the memory of what was once most beautiful." And when he saw a little girl, the neighbor's daughter, running around the garden, shouting with joy at the sight of a bee landing on a salvia bloom, Daniel understood. Memories never truly die if someone is brave enough to replant them. The wave, called Eleuthera floris, spread as quickly as bees in peak honey season. The story of a couple in the New Mexico desert, two people who brought the last bees back to life, was no longer just a heartwarming headline. It became the focus of the scientific community, the media, and of those who didn't want the story to spread any further. 3 weeks after the video went viral, they received an invitation for a meeting with Helix Crapone, of the last surviving biotech corporations after the environmental collapse. Its headquarters still stood firm in Seattle, like a cold fortress amidst the ashes of a fallen city. Arya and Daniel were picked up in an armored electric vehicle and seated across from top executives in a gleaming glass-paneled boardroom. The man in charge extended his hand, voice smooth as oil. "We'd like to acquire full rights to the Eleuthera floris seed and your bee care system. Starting offer, $50 million, plus a state-of-the-art lab with full security." Under the table, Daniel squeezed Arya's hand. They had once lived on their last $5. They had eaten cold rice and water for a month when their first hive died. They had lost nearly everything except each other. And the dream? Arya asked, "What if we say no?" The man gave a thin smile and slid a stack of documents across the table. "Then we'll replicate the plant ourselves, file a patent, and you'll be sued for unauthorized use of unregistered bioproperty. Trust me, history always favors those who move faster." That night, in their small wooden cabin on the edge of the desert, the wind rustled through the first blooms of Eleuthera floris. Arya sat quietly, gently stroking a sleeping bee resting on her fingertip. Daniel placed the old notebook in front of her. Inside were the very first lines they had written 20 years ago. "No one has the right to own nature. If there is any right, it is only the right to protect it." They didn't need much time to decide. The next morning, they released the full source code of the bee care system, publishing the genetic structure of Eleuthera floris on an open-source platform. They shared the entire cross-pollination process. The soil compatibility maps, everything for free. The description consisted of a single line: "The world doesn't need a savior. It needs everyone to become a keeper." A wave of sharing swept across biology forums, university classrooms, young farmers, and even in the most devastated regions, people began planting Eleuthera using seeds downloaded from the internet. Helix Crop was powerless to stop it. The seeds were now in the hands of millions. Never in human history had the sound of buzzing wings been so welcomed. Just 6 months after Arya and Daniel published the open-source data, more than 300 Eleuthera gardens bloomed across the country from the arid stone plains of Texas to university campuses in Colorado. Once abandoned patches of land, scorched by drought, now burst with clusters of purple and yellow blossoms swaying in the wind, whispering something ancient. Agricultural universities, many of which had once shut down their entomology departments because there were no more bees to study, began reopening those programs. But this time, students didn't sit inside sterile labs. They built artificial hives together, crafted from recycled materials, and placed them among native wildflowers. A new generation was growing up not just learning about bees, but learning to listen to nature. From that movement, a nonprofit organization was born, carrying a name that felt like both a vow and a warning. Before the last bee falls. Each month, thousands of volunteers signed up not to do anything grand, but to relearn something basic. Plant a seed, place a bowl of clean water for the bees, build a tiny shelter under the eaves of a house. In the hills of northern New Mexico, where Aria and Daniel had once stood with nothing but their dream, now stood the organization's headquarters. Still the same humble wooden house. Still the row of Eleuthera floris rustling gently in the wind. But now children came from everywhere, eyes wide with wonder, scribbling in notebooks when they saw a bee retract its proboscis from a flower. One evening, Daniel and Aria sat side by side on the wooden steps, fingers interlaced, watching bees drift softly across the salvia blooms. The sky was clear, no drone noise, no pollution alerts like in the old days, only the sound of bees. Aria whispered, her voice like breath itself. "So, we really can go back?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply squeezed her hand and looked up at the sky with its tiny bees tracing invisible paths between bursts of color. They knew what they had done couldn't change the past, but it was enough to seed a future not for themselves, but for the world. And as long as someone out there still remembered how important that buzzing once was, the dream would never go extinct. If this story made you pause and listen, click like to send a quiet thank you to those who are silently protecting life, every flower, every bee, every small dream that still dares to bloom. Share this video to spread hope, because the future isn't something we wait for. It's something we can replant today. Subscribe to this channel to stay with us on the journey of telling real stories about nature, humanity, and the quiet goodness still alive in the world. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so that each time a new buzz rises, you'll be the first to hear it. Because to save a planet, sometimes all it takes is saving a single hive. Rue.